Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I was recently asked to respond to a challenge to one of the fundamental ethical premises that I hold. That premise is that for an innocent individual, continued life, in any state, even a very bad state, is more desirable than death. As to what constitutes an innocent individual, definitions may vary, but I would venture to say that almost all of you in my audience today would qualify, if not all of you. So the challenge to my viewpoint here is a scenario akin to the World Trade Center bombing, where many of the victims chose to jump to their deaths from 90 stories instead of perishing in a blazing inferno. And the essence of the challenge is if there is this situation where one might artificially hasten the arrival of one's death by a few seconds or a few minutes in order to avoid a much more gruesome death, then would it be legitimate to do so here? And I have several responses to that kind of challenge. First, as a more general response, I would refer the audience to Ayn Rand's essay, The Ethics of Emergencies, which states that extraordinary situations, emergency situations, where a lot is at stake within a very short period of time, or where there is such extreme scarcity of resources that it seems, and here's the key term, it seems that one can't get out of that situation without somebody's life being lost or being sacrificed, the so-called lifeboat scenarios. Those should not serve as general ethical guides, because fundamentally the purpose of ethics is to guide individuals in everyday life, in everyday decisions. And in the vast majority of contexts, while some people do meet unfortunate fates in natural disasters or man-made disasters, those kinds of constraints do not exist. So in terms of general ethical principles, those ethical principles need to be applicable to everyday life. And even if some exceptions are admitted in emergency circumstances, those exceptions do not override the ethical principles that apply on an everyday basis. So if on an everyday basis, continued life is more desirable than the death of the individual, if on an everyday basis it is never justified to sacrifice one individual's life, one innocent individual's life to save another, then that is still a general ethical principle that still remains just as valid in terms of everyday well-considered decision-making that the overwhelming majority of ethics would address. But I would go further than that. I would go further than Ayn Rand went and actually look at the emergency circumstances themselves. And even in the emergency circumstances, I would argue that it is never justified to artificially hasten either one's own death or the death of an innocent other individual. And here is how I would make that argument. I would bring in the fact that human beings' knowledge about the future outcomes of any such event is inherently extremely limited, particularly if it's an emergency, particularly if it is something that has struck very suddenly and without warning, such as the World Trade Center attacks. Hindsight is very accurate regarding what happened. However, from the vantage point of someone who is experiencing that event, very little is certain. They don't know exactly what occurred from what source, how much damage was inflicted, what the likely future of that building is going to be, what the reasonable likelihood of escape would be, and to be sure, many of these victims did try to escape and did their best and did not make it. So even the best intentions in that kind of emergency situation wouldn't necessarily result in the best outcome. And this is not something that ethics requires. Ethics does not require every action or every attempt by an individual at an action to be successful or to actually fulfill the chosen goal. That would be very good, that would be very desirable, but human beings are limited. And within those limitations, human beings can make mistakes. Sometimes mistakes that end up suggesting that the course of action made with the best intentions was quite counterproductive. Still, from the vantage point of someone in that situation, it's not at all clear that jumping to one's death is the only way to avoid a gruesome death in a blazing inferno. There could be, at least from that vantage point, many other outcomes to that. One outcome could be that the building damage really isn't all that great, and it would be possible either to save the building or at least for the people in it to escape in time. Another possible outcome is there could be some sort of rescue that is effected. It didn't happen in the World Trade Center situation, but it could happen in another situation where some of the other facts are different. To jump to one's death is to make an assumption that the outcome is certain in the future, that there's no way to avoid death. And I would say that assumption cannot be made even if it looks like the probable outcome. Even if it looks very probable that no matter what one does, one will not be able to escape. Because probability is also a function of the information that one has. Probability isn't some objective fact that exists out there. Probability is very much based on the subjective perception of the individual. What the individual knows and what the individual doesn't know, what the individual is uncertain about. Probability is essentially an attempt to gauge how much uncertainty exists and what the likelihood of various outcomes is given that uncertainty. If you knew, for instance, every minute physical force that was acting on a coin as it was tossed up in the air, it would no longer be a 50% probability of heads on that coin and a 50% probability of tails. That 50-50 guess is just what you're able to determine based on the best information available to you, which is really pretty limited. And so it is with every other event. And in an event of extreme uncertainty, such as a natural disaster or a man-made disaster like the World Trade Center bombings, there's not much that can be known. And so, while one should try to save oneself, one should try to act on one's best probabilistic estimate of the situation, even if it's a very rough estimate. It is not justified to give up, because giving up assumes certainty of knowledge. It assumes the certainty of knowing that nothing good can possibly happen, or that nothing can save oneself. And I think that insight can be generalized to other ethical situations in emergency situations. So, for instance, with the lifeboat scenarios, what happens in that kind of scenario? It's typically posited this way. You're out in the middle of an ocean, there's been a shipwreck, and say there are 2 people in the lifeboat, and you estimate that there are only enough supplies for 1 person. So what do? And the insinuation here is the noble moral thing would be to jump overboard and let the other person have the supplies. I disagree with that. Again, uncertainty is a big part of the picture. What if you estimate that you will be out on the ocean for 14 days, but really after 7 days, a helicopter appears and rescues the 2 of you? If you had plunged to your death, then you would have missed out on that possibility of rescue. On the other hand, if you had taken the opposite course of action and, for instance, cannibalized on the other person or sacrificed the other person, then you would legitimately be found guilty of murder, and besides, you would have destroyed an innocent life. So neither of those courses of action is desirable. In that kind of situation where there's limited knowledge, there may be a lot of survival pressure, but also a lot of uncertainty. The correct course of action is always to try to survive, try to save yourself without harming innocent other people, and hold out for hope. So I think that insight reaffirms my premise that for an innocent individual, whether it's you or someone else, continued life is always more desirable than death, than either sacrificing yourself or sacrificing other people.